Welcome everyone to the Voices of the River webinar series, where we aim to host the water industry experts to present on a variety of topics to educate, inspire, and empower people towards positive change for our waterways. I'm Jennifer Lanham with the Cotswold National Landscape.
And I'm Sam Thrift from Earthwatch Europe.
Today's presenter, Jo Bradley, has dedicated her career to the subject of pollution control for over 30 years. Most of that time has been with the Environment Agency, working alongside various industry sectors to develop best practice for pollution prevention and control. She joined Stormwater Shepherds in 2020 as Director of Operations and specializes in urban and highway pollution. Jo focuses on collaborating with highway drainage professionals and researching to develop improved guidance. Her presentation today is Highway Horror, the Invisible Pollution on Our Roads. It's an absolute privilege to have you here today, Jo. We are so keen to learn more about the risks and consequences of unmonitored pollution and pollutants. It's a really, really important topic, and it's great to have you here to tell us more about it.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here. It's my first gig back after the Christmas break, so I'm all fresh and ready to go. Let me just get my slides up and we'll get going quickly. Excellent. Can you see that okay, Jennifer? Just nod. Yeah,
that's
good. Okay, so just as a bit of background, I'm Jo Bradley. Jennifer's told you my background. I work for a little charity called Stormwater Shepherds, and we are dedicated to reducing pollution from urban surfaces, but my focus has been very much on pollution from highway runoff for the last few years, just because it's the biggest sort of unmanaged source of urban pollution, and very few other people are dealing with it. So I thought, well, I'll do it. Why not? And it's also the largest terrestrial source of microplastic microplastic particles in our oceans. And so those of you who have half an eye on global impacts of climate change might be interested in understanding the effects of microplastic particles in oceans. And this is the biggest source of those. So this is something we desperately need to manage better. So what is highway runoff and what are we doing about it? The truth is we're not doing very much about it. It's been in the too hard box for a very long time, and there's still very little appetite to do anything about it, although that's changing slightly. I've been talking about it for a decade now, and we are seeing a slight shift. But you can see from that image on the right, that's what they call a concrete slip-form drainage channel on the M6 in Cheshire. And you can see all the pollution that's gathered in that channel off the road surface. So from tyres and exhaust emissions and brake pads and bits off vehicles and rubbish and cigarette ends. And that all gathers in that drainage channel and then washes, when it rains, just washes down into the drainage infrastructure. And in that particular location, just goes straight into the river. So it's a massive problem. That's a massive amount of pollution. If you look in that channel there, we're talking about several tons per hectare per year of this particulate pollution off the carriageway into our water environment. And there are 25,000 outfalls that belong to national highways, so off our motorways and trunk roads. And then we think there are probably 1 million outfalls in total, including all the other roads, all the local authority roads and rural roads and private roads. So it's a massive problem. So when it rains, all that stuff on that carriageway in that drainage channel washes into the river. And this is a little outfall in a place called Cleckheaton near Leeds, where the runoff off the M62 goes straight into this little stream. And this little stream, for those of you who are familiar with the Water Framework Directive, this little stream is a watercourse. It's protected in law. The law says it should be a clean, uncontaminated watercourse that supports aquatic life, and it doesn't, because it's grossly polluted with toxins off the motorway every time it rains. And that's unacceptable and illegal, but it's going on at least 25,000 locations all the time. And especially this week when it's just rained, we've had that awful rain after quite a long dry spell, and the runoff will have been grossly contaminated. So what's in it? Why do I stay awake all night worrying about this stuff, which I do? Lots and lots of toxic metals, so lots of copper and zinc. Copper and zinc way in excess of the environmental quality standard, which is a standard set to protect aquatic life. Lots of other metals as well, cadmium, chromium, lead, platinum, rhodium, you name it, it's in there. But the copper and zinc are the ones we focus on because we know they're toxic to aquatic life. They kill fish. They affect insects. They build up in the ecosystem, so we know they're a problem. Lots and lots of microplastic tire wear particles. Something like 63,000 tons of microplastic tire wear particles off UK roads every year is estimated, and they just wash off. They blow away to some extent, and they also wash off when it rains. And they're poisonous themselves. They leach out poisons from the rubber within them and the additives within them, but they also carry pollutants. Pollutants stick to them, so they carry pollutants into the aquatic environment. And then there's polyaromatic hydrocarbons, and these guys are what I have tended to focus on in the past before we started talking about microplastic tire wear particles, because polyaromatic hydrocarbons are toxic. And so they have an environmental quality standard, and the Environment Agency is statutorily obliged to measure, monitor and control discharges of them. So these all cause horrible harm to aquatic life, but they are also harmful to humans. There's very little research into the harm that these may cause to humans in the river environment. So if you're a river swimmer, there's very little evidence, or indeed, sorry, there's very little research to say what a risk they might pose. But for aquatic life, their risks are, I'm going to say endless. They probably are almost endless, but they're horrific. Part of the problem is that the harm that these toxins cause is sublethal. So it doesn't really kill things, but it causes mutations, it causes deformities, it causes mutations at the embryonic stage. So creatures are deformed before they're born or hatch, and therefore they can't thrive. These toxins affect bone and liver metabolism, they affect heart function, they prevent the act of reproduction, but they also cause abortion, they cause eggs to fail to hatch, they're carcinogenic, they can lead to carcinogenic tumours in creatures that live long enough. And they affect behavior as well. So they affect the ability of the little insects to run away from things that might eat them, but also to chase after the food that they want to eat themselves. So all these effects are sublethal. And so we don't see swathes of dead things in rivers. If we did, in some respects, that almost would have been better, because we would have dealt with this 30 years ago. The fact that it just suppresses the population, causes failure to thrive, causes failure to grow. It's not as visible as death. They do cause death as well. I was reading a research paper yesterday, and it talked about the effects on freshwater shrimps of highway runoff. And it said that they didn't die straight away, but mortality after 14 days was lower than it should have been. So the creatures are dying, but they're sort of dying slowly rather than all at once. And that's a massive problem for the whole ecosystem. So if I just go back, that little guy in that spoon there is a mayfly nymph. So that lives in the river, and then that hatches and becomes a mayfly. Mayflies are a primary food source for certain species of bird and bat. And so if we affect the population of insects in rivers, then we're affecting the whole ecosystem. So not only are we suppressing the population, so they've not got as much food to eat, but also the food that they're eating is contaminated with toxic metals that accumulate in the bodies of the birds and the otters and the fish, the bigger fish, and therefore cause harm all the way up the ecosystem. So fundamentally, it's a massive problem. We have published a paper last May in partnership with SciWem that sort of details all this in quite a lot of detail. So if you're interested in the topic and you'd like to read some more, then you can download that document free of charge from my website or SciWem's website. So the national highways outfalls that I've talked about, the 25,000 national highways outfalls, tend to discharge straight into the water environment off the motorway, so that you literally go to where the motorway crosses the river and you'll see huge big concrete pipes, and it just runs straight into the river. But you do have to remember that not all highway outfalls belong to national highways. So a lot belong to the local highway authority, but also not all highway runoff goes straight into the water environment. Some of it goes into the sewer. So just remember, when you're looking at highway outfalls on your catchments, sometimes they may come through a storm sewer overflow. So the the highway runoff might go into the sewer and then discharge into the river when the storm sewer overflow activates, which is something that we've all been talking about for a long time. Sometimes highway runoff will go straight into the foul sewer and make its way to the sewage works, and then the toxins then have the associated effects at the sewage works, and all those nasty particles end up in the sewage sludge. And sometimes it may discharge through a private sewer or a local authority drain. So there are different ways in which way this stuff can get into the water environment. The last bullet point is also really important, and particularly in your part of the world, sometimes this runoff just goes straight to ground with no treatment at all. And National Highways have a research paper that says that's fine. But I would dearly love more research, because my instinct tells me that's not fine. We're talking about huge volumes of toxic bioaccumulative pollutants, and I find it hard to believe that they can just keep discharging to ground at thousands and thousands of litres every time it rains without potentially having an impact on groundwater. And this is a really good example. So this is a ditch at the side of the A3M in a place called Waterlooville near Portsmouth, I think. I'm not very good at geography. And the runoff from this road goes straight into this ditch, no treatment, straight off the edge of the road and into this ditch. And you can see that this ditch is on the chalk. You can literally pick up the pieces of chalk as you stand there. And so that runoff is going straight into that ditch. It's held back a little bit by those rubber berms so that it's encouraged to soak into the ground, and it goes straight into the ground with no treatment. Now, I just find it really hard to stomach the prospect that that's not causing any harm. We're talking about dissolved pollutants, particulate pollutants, bioaccumulative pollutants. I just think that we need to do far more research on that, because I don't think that little ditch is providing enough treatment. But I stand to be corrected. So why are we in this mess? Where is the regulator? That's a very good question that we often ask ourselves. But there is a legislative framework. So that picture there is a discharge of highway runoff mixed in with local road runoff and actually some agricultural runoff, all discharging into a little stream in Cumbria. And it's quite an important picture, because although the toxic levels of pollution in that outfall aren't as bad as they are off the M6 in Preston, for example, that little stream is a beautiful, almost pristine watercourse coming down off the fells of Cumbria. And so the effects are horrific, because that stream supports really big, good populations of freshwater invertebrates. So this pollution is particularly bad. The other reason I was interested in this location is that this site is immediately upstream of a cattle watering point. So when it's raining, the cows are drinking that, which can't be good for the cows, or indeed the people who drink the milk and eat the meat. So it's another problem. And so you look at that, I look at that with my old Environment Agency hat on. That discharge is a strict liability criminal offence. The legislation for water quality in this country is very clear and very black and white. If you cause pollution of a watercourse, it's a strict liability criminal offence. Doesn't matter if you meant to do it, doesn't matter why you did it, it just matters that you did it, and you stand to be prosecuted. If anybody else was making that discharge, they probably would be prosecuted, but for some reason, the highway authorities have never been investigated or monitored closely. One of the defences against the strict liability criminal offence is that you have a permit. And so theoretically, if the legislation was to work properly, the highway authority would have a discharge. The environmental regulator would go, that discharge is polluted, you must have a permit. The highway authority would apply for the permit, and then the environmental regulator would say, in order to prevent this pollution causing harm to the aquatic environment, you must give this much treatment. So you must have a vortex separator and a pond that treats all rainfall up to a 1 in 1 year rainfall event or whatever. So the permit would dictate how much pollution control you have to provide in order to protect the river. That's how the whole permitting process is supposed to work. And that would then drive the installation of loads of treatment devices on loads of highway outfalls across the UK, and the manufacturers of highway treatment devices would be delighted, and the economy would benefit. But that doesn't happen. There are, we think, 1 million discharges. We know there are 25,000 off the motorway network. Not a single one of them has a permit. None of them. None of them have ever been asked to apply for a permit. But because they contain priority hazardous substances that exceed the environmental quality standards, and I've sampled some, so I know that that's true, and that's in that report that I've just given you the link for. Actually, the regulator has a statutory duty to control these discharges. So the legislative framework is very clear. These outfalls cause pollution. They don't have a permit. They're causing a breach of the environmental quality standard for priority hazardous substances. So the environmental regulator should serve notice on them. And it doesn't happen. And the reason that's interesting for you, you're probably sitting there thinking, God, what's she going on about? The reason that's interesting for you is that if you get a sample of a highway outfall and then say to the Environment Agency, this highway outfall is causing pollution, what are you doing about it? And they say, we're not doing anything about it, we don't have the resources. You can complain about them to the the regulator that regulates the Environment Agency. And that hasn't happened yet, but I think that's something that will happen this year. I think that's something that we might start to brigade groups like yours and wildlife trusts and other river activist groups to try and just say to the Environment Agency, there's a pollution here, what are you doing about it? And then when they come back and say, we're not doing anything about it because we haven't got the resources, we can complain about them because they have a statutory duty to do something about it and they're not. So that's possibly my cunning plan for 2025. The other reason nothing happens is because there's a voluntary agreement between National Highways and the Environment Agency. And that's been in place for 22 years, I think, something like that, where the Environment Agency said to National Highways, they built a risk assessment model together back in 2002-ish. They built it together. They spent a lot of money building the model. They did lots of research. They did lots of sampling. And they built the model together. And then the Environment Agency said to National Highways, you just use that model. You decide if your outfalls are going to cause pollution or not. And you decide whether you're going to deliver any treatment at your outfalls. And they've been doing that for 20 plus years. And every single one of their outfalls is still causing pollution. So as far as I'm concerned, the voluntary agreement isn't working. I stand to be corrected if anybody disagrees, but if it worked, this pollution would not be carrying on. So as far as I'm concerned, it's not working. So again, that's something else we as river activists and advocacy groups and people like that, we can write to our MP and say, we would like to see better regulation of highway outfalls. We don't think the voluntary agreement between National Highways and the Environment Agency is working. And the more we say that, and you and I say that, and people like us, the Rivers Trusts and London Waterkeeper and groups like that say this isn't working, the more likely we are to get it fixed. And just to cheer you all up a bit, because it's the new year and we don't want to be gloomy, we know how to fix this. Treating highway runoff is relatively straightforward, or at least treating it to an extent that it's much less polluting is relatively straightforward. We can remove between 50 and maybe 70% of the pollution quite easily. Removing all of it is really hard, and we probably won't do that. But if we did 50 to 70% at 50 to 70% of the outfalls, we would make a huge difference to river water quality in the UK. And frankly, if we don't do this, you can fix all your storm overflows you like, we will not get clean rivers. This is a problem that's affecting most rivers. It's toxic, it's persistent. And if we don't deal with this, you can do all you want with your sewage, you will still have polluted rivers. So at the moment, all this £56 billion they're spending on storm overflows is worth naught because they're not doing this as well. And so they're just wasting their time and money. The money should be proportionately assigned to the pollution as it affects the rivers. So looking at your river catchment, the even load catchment, agriculture is your biggest source of pollution because it's an agricultural catchment. And so the money should be given to the farmers and growers to help them to prevent pollution of the watercourse. That would be the most sensible way to invest in pollution prevention money on a catchment like yours. And in where I live in Wigan, near Wigan, the most sensible place to invest that money would be on a highway runoff. And so we've got to get much better in this country at assigning investment in pollution prevention to the actual sources of pollution that are affecting our rivers, rather than the most politically, what's the word, sort of focused, spotlighted topics like sewage. So, rant over, I promise. There are two things we have to do. One is remove the sediment. So we need something to catch the sediment and get that out, because most of the pollution is in the sediment. So that nasty black gunge that we saw on that first slide, if we get most of that out, we will have made a big difference. And then if you can, you take out some of the dissolved pollutants, so the dissolved metals and polyaromatic hydrocarbons. So that's the second step. And we can do that. It's more expensive and more difficult, but we can do that. So for the strategic road network, we have to do a particular type of treatment because the pollution is so horrific. And on local roads and rural roads, we can use sustainable drainage systems. So I'll show you the difference in those two devices. Just for information, this image on the right is a pond that treats the runoff from a road north of Preston, a new road that Lancashire County Council have built. And this is the pond that they put in to treat the runoff. And it's really beautiful and they've done a good job. But you have to maintain them. So good ponds are lovely, but only if we look after them. And it is an important point. I won't talk about maintenance in any detail today, but all these things I'm going to talk about as treatment devices have to be maintained, and we have to have money to do that. And frankly, there are a lot of local authorities and national highways as well who don't maintain their treatment devices. So this pond on the left here treats the runoff from a little industrial park and a pub and part of that roundabout. It's been there, I think, 30 years now, and it's never had any maintenance. So slowly but surely, the reeds are filling in that gap in the middle where the pond should be. And it's still delivering treatment, pollution control, but it's not functioning as it was designed to function because it's never had any maintenance. And somebody should go in there every 5 years and cut those reeds out of the middle, but they don't because they've got no money. So this is one of the solutions. This is a huge and expensive solution, but this is a National Highways one. So they have to have big solutions because they've got big pollution. And this is in Exeter, near a place called Stover Park. So they built this about 3 or 4 years ago, no more than that, because it was before I started at Stormwater Shepherds, so before 2020. And this is a huge sediment trap. So the design of this, you can just see where that gentleman's crouching down at the top. That's the inlet pipe. And the design of this is designed to catch that runoff and let it rest for a few minutes so that the sediment settles out. And that's what it looked like when they finished it. It's a bit more greened up now. There's a big old sort of ethical question mark over creating treatment devices like that, which will be poisonous, but then allowing wildlife into them. And it's something we could talk about for hours, but we won't. But it is worth remembering when you're treating very grossly polluted runoff. How do you manage that with wildlife? It's quite difficult. But that's a good sediment trap. It's a functional sediment trap. It captures all the sediment. And then every 5 years, you come in with a huge vacuum tanker and suck all the gunge out. And it does the job. You can also use something like this. This is a vortex grit separator. This is like a Dyson cleaner for stormwater. So the stormwater comes in on the left and then it spins round and the sediment settles out. And then the cleaner stormwater goes out on the right and goes on into a pond. Devices like this, there are 2 or 3 different designs. You can have them that way, vertical, or you can have a horizontal one that works slightly differently. These are fantastic as a sort of first stage treatment device for highway runoff, because they just catch about 50% of the sediment. And with that, they will capture about similarly 50 or 60% of the toxic metals and a significant proportion of the tire wear particles and the polyaromatic hydrocarbons. So if you can do nothing else and you do this and you do it well, it's a really good first step because it captures those gross pollutants. You can also use, this is the one that's the other shape that I mentioned. So this is a horizontal flow separator, does the same thing. So the water comes in on the left, the sediment settles out, any oil is captured in the chamber in the middle, and then the discharge goes out on the right-hand side. And about 50 to 80% of the suspended solids have been removed. So again, a fantastic workhorse for treating highway runoff, dead easy to maintain. You just bring your big sucky vacuum tanker and suck all the gunge out, and they are really good. And then obviously, if you can, you go on to a pond. The other treatment system that I really love, and I get teased for this because they're quite old-fashioned, is a filter drain. So the concept of a filter drain is you've got about 1/2 metre of clean stone and the sediment gets caught in all the little gaps between the stones. And it also gives you some flood risk management because the water can slow down in the stones before it rushes down into the river. And you can include a layer, you can just see in the middle of that image, a layer of that says SDS Aqua Exchange, but there are others on the market. And that's a treatment media. It's a bit like cat litter. is sort of glorified expensive cat litter, and that captures the dissolved pollutants. So you can put that into your filter drain and you've captured all your sediment, and now you've captured your dissolved pollutants as well, all at the side of the road in half a metre of space. So they're a good option for, especially when you're protecting groundwater, you can then line your filter drain and prevent those pollutants going to ground. And then when you've taken out those gross pollutants, then you can let nature do its thing. So if you then create a pond like the one in Lancashire, you've got sunshine breaking down the oils, you've got plants taking up the nutrients, you've got microorganisms breaking down the organic pollutants, you've got sedimentation and precipitation and assimilation and all these processes taking place that take the pollution out of the water. So once you've taken the gross pollution out, then these are fab. But you do need to make sure you're not just building a toxic swamp because nobody wants a toxic swamp. And they have to be designed well and they have to be maintained. And this one is maintained. The other one I showed you isn't. And they just stopped working in the end. So that's motorways. That's what you do for motorways. It's expensive. Those treatment schemes can cost £3.5, £4 million to build. So that's National Highways problem, not ours particularly. For more rural roads and local authority roads, then we start to shift into sustainable drainage systems, which are, we can just use nature to deal with the pollution because the pollutant level is lower. So if you're talking about the road outside your house or the road you drive down to a primary school or the road in a village near you, then all of a sudden that pollution load is much, much lower than it was on the motorway. And all of a sudden we can start to ask nature to deliver that treatment for us. So this image is a bioremediation zone or a rain garden in Sheffield town centre, and the road runoff and the pavement runoff just goes straight over the edge, over that curbstone, flat curbstone you can see, and into the bioremediation zone. And so the suspended solids are caught on the surface of the soil, the nutrients are taken up by the plants, sunshine breaks down the organic pollutants, the microorganisms in the soil break down the organic pollutants, the metals are assimilated and precipitated into the soil horizons. And so all that pollution control that we talked about can happen in a rain garden like that, but only because the pollution load is so much lower. So we never, ever use these for motorways. The other thing, this is a picture of a similar, this is in Sheffield as well, and this is a similar one, but you can just see more easily on this image. They've literally just put gaps in the curbstones at the side of the road, so the road runoff goes into that rain garden and soaks down into the soil. The glorious thing about these is that they do that pollution control beautifully, but they also give you flood risk management. So they capture the water, it soaks into the soil, and it doesn't rush off into the river and contribute to urban flooding. So with the weather we've had recently, there's a massive push to put more of these into our urban centres to reduce urban flooding. And if they're good sustainable drainage systems, they will also deliver habitat for wildlife, like that one does, and beautiful places for people to spend time. So that's what good SUDS should do. It should do water quality improvements, water quantity improvements, habitats for wildlife, and pleasing places for people. And frankly, the Sheffield ones are fantastic. And I often say they're the best in the country. They're certainly the best I've ever seen. You can also use filter drains on rural roads. This is in Cumbria on the A66. And again, the sediment is captured in the stone, and you can include that layer of treatment media. They need to not have overhanging trees, though, because otherwise the leaf matter blocks them up. And you can combine these things. We're not going to talk about money today because I've not got enough time, but funding for these devices is a massive problem. There isn't any. But what local authorities are doing is starting to get quite cute and say, okay, well, we're doing some traffic calming on this road. When we build the traffic calming, we'll turn them into SUDS. So this is in Enfield in London, and they were delivering traffic calming on this local road. And instead of just having stub outs, which were tarmacked, they turned them into rain gardens. So they were able to pay for that through the traffic calming fund, but they're delivering SUDS at the same time. So stuff like that is good. Councils are finding ways to pay for this work. And then swales, I should show you this picture first, really. This is a swale. So this is a very, very common roadside sustainable drainage device for low traffic roads and rural roads. So literally the road runoff and the pavement runoff just goes into that grassy ditch, and the pollutants soak away and get caught in the soil, and the plants take up the nutrients, as I mentioned before. This is an old one that was originally mowed, and it was just green grass and it was a bit grim. but the council stopped mowing it to let it get more bushy and better for wildlife. And then the local people complained and said, "You've stopped mowing our swale." So now what they do is they just mow about half a metre on each side. So you can see that they've mowed it, but they don't mow the middle bit so that it's better for wildlife. And it's quite a good and effective one. This is what we call a bioswale. So this is just much bigger and bushier. And this is fantastic. So if you've got a rural road and you can deliver something like this, you've got flood alleviation and habitat for wildlife and a beautiful place for homes to overlook, and you're catching all your pollution. So they're a good solution, but they're quite big. And then final point really is, if you're going to do suds, don't do rubbish suds. This is a sud device on Marylebone High Street in London, and it's just not. It was a waste of time. That if you're going to do suds, then do nice suds. Don't do rubbish suds. And this, nobody can tell me that that's a nice habitat for wildlife, because it's not. It's not a pleasing place for people to spend time. It's not going to attract people to Marylebone High Street to come and see the suds, that's for sure. But also it's probably stopped working, because you can see the soil's got quite crusty and dry. So when it rains hard, the water won't soak into the soil anyway. It'll just get caught on the surface and then go down the road. So we need to be really, really careful when we talk about suds for treating highway runoff, that we do good suds and not rubbish suds, or else we're just going to end up with like these everywhere. And there was one in Camden. Somebody showed me a picture of one in Camden a couple of weeks ago that's literally got no plants in it at all. It's just a muddy, it's literally just a patch of mud in the middle of Camden. And if you do that, people go, "Well, suds are rubbish because they're just muddy puddles." And then nobody wants them. We have to get better at delivering really good suds so that everybody goes, "Yeah, I want suds." Because this is the future. This is delivering flood risk management and pollution control. And that's what we're going to need a lot more of, and very quickly. So just to summarise, with this is an image of Hogs Mill, which is somewhere West London. I'm ashamed to say I'm not knowing exactly where it is, but you can see this highway discharge not only causing gross pollution with that grey discoloration, but you can also see that brown froth at the side is actually diesel. So a massive pollution of a chalk stream coming from a highway, which is unacceptable. We have got a funding problem. There isn't a clear funding stream for fixing this. But that's why it's really important to talk to groups like yourselves, because the more of us that keep saying to our MPs and our local policymakers and government and DEFRA and the Office for Environment Protection, this is a massive problem, we have to fix it. The more voices that say that, the more further forward and the more quickly we will move forward on this problem. That's me. I am on Twitter or X. I'm also on Blue Sky because I'm very 21st century. And also I'm on LinkedIn. And if you're interested in this topic, then follow me on LinkedIn, because that's where I tend to post my sort of technical stuff, if people are interested. And hopefully I've completely lost track of time. We've got a little bit of time for
You're in
questions.
good time, Jo. Thank you. My mind is absolutely blown by this content. Yeah. It is an absolute nightmare, and it is an invisible nightmare because there is no research. It's absolutely shocking in a country like England to have this be a problem.
To be fair, Jennifer, everybody has it. No country really is dealing with this properly. Germany do a bit. Parts of America have got good suds. There are out in the Far East, some places are quite good at it. Other places are rubbish. Nobody's really dealing with it. Sweden are quite good, of course. Aren't Sweden good at everything? But even there, they're not doing enough treatment.
Yeah. I think if you could touch on two different things. Whilst you were talking about the suds, I was wondering about the potential bioaccumulation of these contaminants in the natural environment. If you're creating ponds and habitat, then you're going to have, whole ecosystem created and a food chain of creatures that are potentially, accumulating these things in their systems, kind of like silent springs. So what do we know about that sort of an issue?
It's a real problem, because particularly for the motorway runoff and highly trafficked roads, the pollutant load is huge. We're talking about grams, if not kilograms, of priority hazardous substances. A lot of the organic ones will break down. So they have a half-life and they will break down in time, but they're toxic and they become more toxic as they break down. But the toxic metals don't break down and they do just bioaccumulate. And so there is a massive risk that if you don't manage and maintain your treatment systems properly, you are just creating a toxic swamp for future generations to deal with. And that's a massive problem. And in fact, I've just been doing some work with a guy looking at the ponds on the M25, which haven't been maintained for 40 years. So they've got 40 years worth of contaminants in them. And yet I've been to them and they've got, there are moorhens and seagulls and creatures living on and in and around them that are being poisoned all the time. And
Shocking.
it's unethical and shocking. And I don't know. That's why I prefer to see manufactured devices upstream of the ponds and basins that to at least give you some treatment before you pass it on into the environment.
Yeah. Do we have any idea what the cost would be of that?
What, the maintenance?
Yeah. Well, actually, the installation of.
Well, certainly those big ponds are 3 or 4 or 5 million pounds to build if you do it well. But that's the motorways. If you're talking about a bioremediation zone like the ones in Sheffield, the Sheffield ones are quite expensive because they're huge. But if you just do a bioremediation zone for a residential road, you might be looking at 35,000 pounds to build it. And then the maintenance is relatively cheap because it's relatively straightforward. You have to prune the vegetation back in the autumn, do some litter picking a couple of times a year, and maybe clean the inlets once a year. So relatively cheap maintenance. So it's definitely a scale from low traffic roads, local roads. It's quite a cheap solution and it's quite cheap maintenance, although it's still essential, up to motorways where actually, frankly, it's blinking expensive.
Right. And if people wanted to get more data on that sort of thing, where would you recommend they go for research documents?
So have a look at the paper I've published because we've done a little bit of research ourselves. So I've taken about a dozen samples and they were all awful. They were all failing the environmental quality standard, but also in there I've referenced some other research documents. There are some. There's quite a lot of research into the tire wear particles and polyaromatic hydrocarbons and toxic metals. The research has been going on for 40 years. What we're missing is that translation of research into action.
Yeah.
It's no good. It's no good going, oh, crikey, this is awful for 40 years and not doing anything about it. And that's really what they've been doing.
Yeah. And sorry, I wanted to also ask about the citizen science approach and using that. And then I'm going to turn it over to Sam because she's running the second half of it, really. Sorry, Sam.
Yeah, I've written a guide for citizen scientists on how to sort of look at the effect of this problem on a watercourse. Because it's not easy to sample. You have to sample it in the first hour of rainfall after a dry spell. So that's very often 3 o'clock in the morning in my experience. So sampling it's not easy. It's not very safe. So you have to have a pair. You have to have some insurance in place. So sampling it's not all that easy. And also every sample you take costs about £200 to analyse. So it's not easy, but there is lots that citizen scientists can do. So simply by finding highway outfalls, going into your local watercourse and taking photographs and videos of them when they're discharging is really powerful because then you can write to your MP and say, look at this, what are you doing about this? You can also, depending on your watercourse, if you're on a chalk stream, you can measure turbidity upstream and downstream, which is really easy to do. And you can see a massive increase in turbidity from upstream and downstream of the road, and that's really powerful. So there are things you can do. Certainly, finding these outfalls, mapping them. I noticed somebody put a question about outfall safaris, and you can include these in your outfall safari. The only thing I would say is please go out in the rain, because outfall safaris are usually done in dry weather, I suppose for safety purposes, really. But highway discharges are invisible when it's not raining. There's no slime left like there is with sewage. There's no sewage litter left like there is with a misconnection. And so they can appear invisible. So it's really important to go out in the rain and look for them. And then they're a nasty dark grey, black colour. They're very easy to spot once you go out in the rain.
Well, we've got so many questions. Actually, Andy, you had your hand up. Are you still around? Do you still want to ask a question? Has it already been answered? Andy? No? Okay, well, let me just read out some of the questions then we've had in the chat during your presentation. I'll read one quickly from Karen. She said she was working at the Environment Agency in 2002 and recalls the Environment Agency Director of Operations went to the Highways Agency around there. Is this maybe why nothing has been done?
Oh, I wouldn't like to cast aspersions, but that's around when the agreement was made. So I'll let Karen take her own assumptions from that. But it's around about 2002 when they finished the research and started to build their risk assessment model and the agreement was made. So I have to say I've never seen the agreement. I think it was a handshake or a verbal agreement. So I've never seen it written down.
Okay. And Paul from South East Wales Rivers Trust has asked, does the Environment Agency and the National Highway Agreement apply to NRW in Wales?
No, strictly it doesn't. Although Welsh Government are doing quite a lot of work on this topic, and Welsh Government have a similar risk assessment model to the one that National Highways, or at least I think they use the same model, but they have a similar process. But Welsh Government are, I'd probably say, a little bit more attuned to this problem than the English lot. I just put in a basket together and moan about them. But yeah, you've a little bit more hope in Wales, I think.
Andy Schofield, you've got your hand raised. Go for it.
Yeah, can you hear me now, Sam?
Yes,
okay?
yes, thank you.
So my computer was I blame it on the computer selecting the wrong mic, but it was me. But yeah, all I wanted to do is I think that I was going to ask the question about the citizen science monitoring and what could people do as citizen scientists in terms of what parameters could they monitor for using the sort of test kits that they might already have. So you mentioned the turbidity be one aspect, Joe, but as you say, it's being there in the right place at the right time, isn't it? Because it's something we're looking at the moment, because obviously there are the Earthwatch. I noticed somebody from Earthwatch is on the call, but the Earthwatch kits, and then, for example, I carry around one of the Angling Trust water quality kits in the back of my car. So it's just, but I think you've answered that point. And the other point I was going to mention, which again has just been, you've just hinted at, Joe, was around the work that Welsh Government are doing. So whilst I work with Paul Kent in the South East Wales Rivers Trust on a part-time basis, my main job is actually working across the Welsh universities, running something called Environment Platform Wales. And we've got a water quality community of research. And one of our group members is a guy called Ian Titherington from Welsh Government. And Ian is a big advocate of trying to do something about road water runoff. So I don't know, Joe, if you've met Ian, but I'd just reiterate what you've just said, that Welsh Government seem to be more aware of the issue.
Yeah, and I think that's Ian's. I think that's down to Ian, and I do know Ian very well, and I think that's the other thing is you've got a guy called Steve Ormerod. Do you know Steve?
I know Steve. Yes,
and Steve's done research on the pollution, the effects of the microplastic tire wear particles on dippers, which are little birds that feed on aquatic insects. So there's probably more research in Wales. The other thing I should have said with the citizen science work is if you do riverfly surveys or invertebrate counts upstream and downstream of highway outfalls, that can be really, really valuable because you'll almost always find a reduction in the population score downstream. If anybody's interested, I would love to do, and in fact, I tried to get funding last year for some research to look at actually doing microscopic inspection of the insects upstream and downstream to see if you can see any evidence of this harm. So deformities, mutations, failure to thrive, parasitic load. Can we see physically the difference in the creatures that are living downstream of the motorway and upstream of the motorway? And that would be really interesting. And I couldn't get the funding to do that, but I'd love to do that.
I need to have a chat with you outside this meeting then, Joe. So within Environment Platform Wales, that's what we do. We try and instigate sort of research collaboration, should we say. And there is potential, particularly working with Cardiff and Bath University and some of the others at the moment, for setting up a project looking at that. It would be in specific catchments, but we could have a chat with you about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Andy. That would be really nice. Yeah.
That'd be fantastic. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Sam.
Jan, you asked a question in the chat. Do you want to ask it in person? You're on mute.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. That was really fascinating and shocking all at the same time. So thank you. But I was just wondering, when this sediment sinks to the bottom of a pond and then gets removed from time to time, or in the separators, then what do you do with it?
Well, sadly, I hate to say this out loud, but it generally gets landfilled. It has to be treated first because it's toxic waste. So it's treated to remove the toxicity of it, which they do in waste treatment centres. There are people trying to find, so there's a group of young students at the moment to see if they can turn it into ink, because it's very, very black in colour and it's got carbon black in it, which can be used for creating ink. There are people who have investigated in the past using it as a construction material because it's gritty, but it's not great because it's got quite a lot of organic matter in it. There are also people investigating the possibility of mining the platinum, palladium and rhodium out of it because they're very precious metals and there's quite a lot in there, but that's not come to anything at the moment. So at the moment it's treated and then landfilled or burnt, which isn't great, but potentially in the future there will be a use for it. But it's such a nasty mixture of rubbers, inorganics, organics and toxins. It's really hard to see how you could do something with it. It's not, if it was just organic you could do something composty with it. If it was just inorganic you could do something constructiony with it, but because it's a mixture it's actually really hard to see what to do with it. And we talk a lot about, can we reduce the amount of pollution? So can we make cars differently so that they don't cause us so much pollution? But that's really hard too, because you have to have tyres. I do sometimes say what we need are those hover cars that they used to have in Back to the Future. That would be my ideal, but I'm not sure that we're going to go there. So as long as we have rubber tyres, we are going to have this problem, which is rubbish.
And also, presumably, if it goes to the sewage treatment works, then that just settles as sediment that gets then put on the fields.
Yeah, and the microplastic tire wear particles, just don't look at the research into microplastic tire wear particles unless you're feeling very brave, because because they're spread on soil, they're starting to get into the food chain, they're starting to find them in people's arteries, they've found them in the placenta of pregnant women, they've found them in the brains of octopuses. The microplastic tire wear particles, or just all microplastic particles, is a massive global problem. And yes, this is a part of it. But what you do with sewage sludge if you don't spread it to agricultural land is a huge problem, because what they used to do was put it all in the sea. I'm old enough to remember the sewage boats going out of the Manchester Ship Canal into the sea, the Irish Sea, and just dropping all the sewage sludge into the sea. Well, can't do that, can we?
No.
I think the important thing there is that there is no such thing as a way. Everything goes somewhere. Whatever goes down your drain, whatever goes off of the roads, it goes somewhere and it will accumulate and it will create a problem if we don't deal with it. We need to deal with it at the beginning, don't we?
We do, and most of this pollution is fundamentally organic if you go deep into the chemistry. I'm not a chemist, so theoretically it can be degraded, and there is lots of research going into using enzymes to break down the pollution, and then you can render it, at least it ceases to be toxic then, and then you can put it onto agricultural land. So there is a lot of research into that area, but it's hard.
And I think,
but it's happening.
Also, kind of considering, this idea of having organic food. If it's not organic, if it's on a river system that's polluted, with forever chemicals or plastics, that all does get washed up during the flooding, doesn't it? And could potentially contaminate crops and livestock. Yeah,
absolutely. There was a horrible thing years ago with the mine water coming from the old metal mines in Cumbria flooding onto the fields, and then the cows would eat the grass, and it had lots of metals, and it caused massive health problems in the cows because they were eating the grass that had the flood water on. So yeah, it is, the whole thing is difficult, and the reason I talk about it and I try and do all this work is because everybody's talking about sewage pollution, everybody's talking about fixing storm overflows and dealing with sewage pollution, and this is just as bad. And in fact, there are, I think, 18,000 storm overflows in the UK, and there are 25,000 highway outfalls off the English motorway network. So this is a massive problem, and probably as big as the sewer overflows. We just need loads of money. If anybody's got loads of money, let me know.
Sam, did you want to touch on what we might be doing within the catchment?
So yeah, we've actually just got some funding to do some road runoff testing ourselves, which is quite exciting. We've got quite a quick turnaround to do, but if there is anyone with an even load catchment that would like to get involved or has knowledge of actually a problematic area, because this is what we're going to be relying on for the even load catchment, is actually knowing where maybe the puddle is forming on the roadside or where it is actually entering a river. As Joe mentioned, actually getting these samples is going to be quite complex, of getting upstream, downstream, a bit further downstream, and being able to safely access the rivers as well to get these samples. So yeah, please do email me at water@earthwatch.org.uk if you'd like to get involved with it in the even load catchment.
I did look at you, just to pick up on that, Sam. I looked at, is it Morton in the Marsh where the A49 goes over the top of the even load? Is that right? Because that would be a good
So
spot.
the even load starts at Morton and Marsh and then runs down through the Witchwoods and eventually comes out on the Thames at Cassington by Oxford.
If you look at Morton in the Marsh where the river comes under the I think it's the A49. I did look.
Yeah.
You may find there's an outfall there, and because it's near the village, you're more likely to find a volunteer to hop out and take samples.
I'm actually Morton in Marsh myself.
God, God, you were just volunteered, Sam. Well done. You can,
that's going to be my site.
The other thing I always say, and I don't think it affects you particularly because you've not got any motorways on the even low catchment, but you mustn't ever go on the motorway networks. You must never go over a fence that belongs to the highway authority or to the national highways to access an outfall, because that's illegal. So I just have to say that to just make sure nobody breaks the law.
No, thank you.
It's all right if it's local authority, it's fine, but it's not if it's the motorway.
One question I had is I've just seen recently work someone's doing on identifying car parks which are actually running directly off into rivers. Is there any way that maybe you're suspicious that your local car park is flowing into a local watercourse? Can you use dye tracing to maybe identify that if the outfall's not clear enough? Is there any sort of identification methods you can use to see if it is road runoff rather than sort of cleaner water?
Yeah, I mean, dye tracing is dead easy. You just have to go out in the rain. So I've been known to sneak around with some drain tracing dye and drop it down gully pots before now and then take a walk down the river. It's very straightforward. Just don't use too much because it's incredibly powerful. It turns the water bright green. And if you use too much, it turns a lot of water bright green. It's always best as well to tell the Environment Agency you're doing it, because they'll get people ringing up saying the river's gone bright green. But it's very straightforward. You just tip a little bit, a couple of teaspoons down the drain you want to trace, and then go down to the watercourse and see if it's gone green.
And if you get a positive identification, what do you do then? Do you then approach the owners of the car park?
Yeah, it's the owners of the car park, and it depends who they are. If they're big supermarkets, you can usually get them to talk about pollution control. If it's a school or a college, then again you can probably get them to talk about SUD. So the first thing to do is to do the dye tracing, prove the connection, and then see if it's causing pollution, because they may have a treatment system, but if they haven't, then have a conversation with them. Most people don't want to cause pollution, so if you tell them that they are, they'll try and put it right. It's just finding the money.
Would you do that alongside reporting it to the Environment Agency as a pollution event?
You can, yes, if you want. I mean, the Environment Agency won't come out, but it's really valuable to report these. And again, if you do any work and you find a highway outfall causing pollution, please ring them up and tell them, because the part of the problem is because nobody ever sees these because they happen in the rain. There's very little highway outfall pollution doesn't feature on their statistics. And so they say, oh, well, it's not a big problem because we don't get reports of pollution from highway outfalls. And it's like, well, that's because it only happens when it's raining and people don't go out in the rain. So absolutely, if you find a highway outfall that's actively causing pollution when you're standing there, then ring up and report it.
Yeah. I think, when you introduced, you were talking about, collaborating and what could be taken forward to get other organizations involved in tackling this. And I think what would be really, really beneficial is to have a kind of a call to action to all people who are concerned and, to all organizations to support. And that could potentially be found within Stormwater Shepherds. People could just, look on your website and see the various things that people could do to actually try and solidify this in the minds of the politicians and drive this forward. I think we met with DEFRA in December, and asked them to actually make clean water a right, a basic human right, and doing things like that. And also, I think one of the other key things that we asked them to do is to create a national reporting scheme or hotline for people if they have been in the river and they have gotten sick, within 24 hours, 48 hours of having been in the river, to actually report it in, because no one's capturing that data. And then, they can potentially look and realize how dangerous the situation is becoming. Because if it isn't being researched at all, and we aren't looking at the health consequences of humans or even the environment, it's a really secret, dangerous situation that we're creeping into.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, the aquatic environment is the most important thing, because if we destroy that, it's the basis of our ecosystem. So that's what we need to measure and monitor, and nobody's doing that. And certainly, going back to what I said about the counting the insects, if your groups can do river fly sampling on your catchments over time, that gives us a fantastic data source that nobody else has got. The Environment Agency used to do it, and they can't do it anymore. And so by getting activists and local action groups and just local citizens to do it, it delivers that really, really good data that then helps us understand which rivers are polluted.
Has anyone else got a question that they are burning to ask? Please raise your hand. If I've missed it on the chat, I apologise. Jo did have her contact details towards the end of her presentation. We'll also publish those when we publish a video onto YouTube. So this is your last chance to ask a question if you'd like to.
So can I just say, Sam, somebody's asked about if there's a map of road runoff outfalls. A journalistic organisation called Watershed Investigations have published the National Highways map. It's not complete, but it gives you a clue as to where some of the National Highways outfalls are. For your local authority outfalls, there is no map, and there's no, at the moment, no sort of move forward to have those mapped. So that's where you guys come in, because you can find the outfalls and write to the Highway Authority and say, put this on your map, it's yours. So it is difficult, but National Highways do have a map of their outfalls, and so I think do the Welsh Government.
Barry, you've raised your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. My question is probably very naive, because I'm just very new into this whole world of citizen science and testing water and so on. Although I have a lifetime of experience in agriculture, not practical agriculture, but supplying agricultural businesses. But it does seem to me that there's a massive problem here of fundamental planning right at the outset. It's taking a holistic approach, and I worry about citizen science as a principle just simply irritating politicians and the people in power to make policy. And so this whole thing is open to being developed very cleverly, or a spread shot type of approach could possibly be more damaging than getting the job done. It's a wonderful thing that you've done, Jo, and all of you, Sam and Jennifer. I was a bit late in, but it's a brilliant dissertation today. It's just fantastic. I knew about it, but not to the extent that you've said. And it just makes me think of this whole thing of planning housing estates, planning road building, planning. As you say, things just don't go down the drain and vanish. They don't.
No.
So I don't know whether there's a question there or not, to be honest. But yeah, no, thank you anyway.
Thank you, Barry. And there's two things there. One, I absolutely agree that 5 years ago, the environmental regulators particularly saw citizen scientists as a almost literal pain in the neck. And they didn't want to accept their data. They didn't want to engage with them. And it was hard work. But I have to say there's been a massive change. And the Environment Agency, Natural Resources Wales and Natural England and others are now actively taking part in catchment partnerships and partnership groups. And they've, I think, recognised that they've got to work together or we're never going to get anywhere. So there's been a big shift. And some of the citizen scientist data is now being gathered and used by environmental regulators. So we have seen a shift in that. So that's good. the planning bit is a massive nightmare. So sustainable drainage systems that I showed you were supposed to be becoming mandatory in 2015, I think, or 2012. Didn't happen. And then the government, the last government, just the recently outgoing government, said they were going to bring mandatory sustainable drainage systems in. And then the new government have said, no, we're not going to do that. So that's gone. And when new roads are built, nobody checks the water quality treatment delivery for new road build schemes. So they do deliver water quality treatments. When you see a new road being built, there'll usually be ponds or basins or swales at the side of the road, but nobody checks that they're big enough or they're designed properly. And that's what the Environment Agency should do, and they just don't do it because they haven't got the resources. So I spend some of my time looking at designs of highway treatment schemes and moaning about them to the designer and saying it's not big enough, it's not deep enough, it's not whatever. So there's a gap in the plan. You're absolutely right. There's a massive gap in the planning requirements.
And I think along those lines of kind of becoming a pain in someone's backside, a good example of that is the number of environmental information requests have shot through the roof since different catchments have been promoting or encouraging people to put these forward to the Environment Agency. And they've gotten so many that they actually, can't respond or won't respond to some of the more pointed questions. And that is, a confession on behalf of the Environment Agency. They have stated that they cannot respond or will not respond to some of these questions. But what it does drive is the urgency and the awareness of the public, and therefore puts pressure on the government and the Environment Agency to increase their staff numbers. They have severely cut the funding to the Environment Agency and effectively castrated them, I think, in the process. But I think public pressure can really encourage the funding of these organizations and the strengthening of them through the process of gathering citizen science data and things like that, where there is no other data coming forward, really.
And I mean, I stand by the 56 billion pounds that the water companies have been allowed to invest in their new business plans for fixing storm overflows. That was purely driven by public awareness, public noise, public outcry. That topic would never have reached that point on anybody's agenda without that noise on social media and in the press. I disagree with it because I think it's 56 billion pounds spent on one source of pollution when there's nothing being spent on the other sources of pollution. I would take that 56 billion and split it equally between farmers, highway authorities and water companies. But nonetheless, that was driven by public activism and public noise. And so we just need to do the same for highway runoff.
Yeah. Can I ask one more question, Joe, whilst you're here, because you know so much about this? The use of tires for in maybe support along, I guess, lake banks or river banks to hold the shoreline in, or just in use in marine and freshwater systems. Is that something that you would recommend? Or if you were using them, say, at a sailing club, would you recommend they pull those things out and dispose of them responsibly?
Oh, Jennifer, I don't know. People talking to me about burying plastic in the ground as part of a sustainable drainage infrastructure, because if you sometimes you'll bury a plastic tank as part of an attenuation system, and people say, well, you're putting plastic into the environment. I think in the scheme of things, if you're doing something to mitigate another environmental harm of some sort, then we may have to just suck up the potential environmental harm of using tires and plastic in or adjacent to the water environment. You've just got to get your priorities in order, haven't you? So if somebody's putting a subsurface tank in made of plastic, but they're preventing ongoing toxic pollution of the water environment, I think that's fine. I think that's defensible. I think potentially using tires to create embankments to prevent erosion of soils into water environments is probably defensible. You just have to think about the priorities, don't you? I mean, they use tires to create fake reefs, I think, underwater in some locations. I don't know. I think we've got bigger fish to fry. Okay. Let's worry about that in a decade when we fix this one.
Yeah. Sam, you got the last closing question?
I have. We ask every guest this at the end of their presentations and the end of their hour. So, Joe, please could you let us know what is your most inspirational book that you could maybe suggest for us to go and read?
Oh, crikey. Well, I can't remember the name of it. I'll share it with you. I'll share it with Jennifer and Sam. So there's a book I read last year about a monk who makes tea. Somebody may know the name of it, and a robot, and the robots had taken over the world, but then the robots had seen what harm was happening, so the robots had retreated, and the little monk who's making tea goes out selling tea on a little. He meets one of the robots, and then they have a conversation about the relationship between humans and machinery and the planet. And it's a really thought-provoking but really lovely story. I apologize, I can't remember the name of it, but I will share that with Jennifer and Sam, and she can share it with the rest of you. And it's really hard, isn't it? If you work in this environment and then you read books about planetary collapse, you could just be miserable all the time. So I try not to. I try and read slightly more positive, optimistic books where I can. So I'll share that with you because it is a really nice book.
Thank you, yeah, and we'll pop it on the YouTube edit as well, so anyone listening back to this will be in the comments below.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jo.
Oh, actually, sorry. So my assistant has just told me it's called "A Psalm in the Wild," but for the Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. A Psalm for the Wild Built, and it's really lovely, particularly because I love tea. Tea is my favorite. Tea is my favorite thing.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Jo. I really applaud your efforts and the efforts of Stormwater Shepherds. It's an amazing charity, and I wish you guys all the success. I think exposing this critical issue is so key to making that change. So thank you for being with us today and answering our questions.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.